The air in the terminal was a familiar, living thing, a constant hum of rolling suitcases, distant security announcements, and the shared, quiet anticipation of 1,000 journeys. For Clara, it was a sound she had known her entire life, the soundtrack to her childhood. But now, it felt different. It was heavier, layered with a profound silence that only she could hear. 6 months ago, this airport, this entire airline, had been her father's domain. Now, it was hers. A vast and complicated inheritance she still felt entirely unprepared for. She stood in the priority boarding lane, a quiet island in the river of travelers flowing around her. At 23, she looked much like the other students flying home for a semester break. Her clothes were chosen for comfort, not for show. A pair of soft, faded blue jeans, a simple gray cashmere sweater that had seen better days, and scuffed leather boots that had carried her across more than a few college campuses. Her hair was pulled back into a loose ponytail, and a few stray strands framed a face that was more thoughtful than glamorous. Her backpack, a worn leather satchel, was slung over one shoulder. Its surface soft and creased with use. To the outside world, she was anonymous. To Clara herself, she was a ghost haunting a life she was supposed to lead. She was the CEO, the sole shareholder of Zenith Air, a position inherited not through ambition, but through tragedy. Her father, a man who built an airline from a single leased plane, had passed away suddenly, leaving her $1 billion empire and a void in her heart that no amount of money could fill. He had raised her on principles of humility and hard work, teaching her that a person's worth was measured in their character, not their clothes or their bank account. It was a lesson she was determined to honor. Even now, flying in her own airline's first-class cabin felt like a betrayal of that lesson. It felt like putting on a costume. So, she booked tickets like anyone else. Choosing a seat in the business cabin as a compromise, a small luxury she felt she could rationalize. More than that, she did it to see, to listen, to understand the real, unfiltered experience of the people who flew with her, the people her father had so deeply cared about, now boarding first class in business. Class passengers for Flight ZA-218 to London. We invite our Diamond and Platinum members to board at this time. The voice over the speaker was smooth and professional. Clara took a deep breath, pulling her ticket from her pocket. She joined the short, orderly line, watching as men and women in sharp suits and designer coats glided past the gate agent. As she approached, she held out her boarding pass. Her passport tucked behind it. The man who took it from her hand was the picture of corporate efficiency. His name tag, pinned to a perfectly pressed navy blazer, read Kevin. He was in his late 30s, with meticulously styled hair and a practiced smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He glanced at her pass, then his eyes did a quick, almost imperceptible scan of her from her simple ponytail down to her worn boots. The smile tightened by a fraction of a millimeter. Right? He said. His voice a blend of politeness and something else, something dismissive. Miss Vance, we seem to have a small issue with our business class seating, a computer error. We're one seat overbooked. We are looking for a volunteer to take a seat in economy with a generous travel voucher, of course. He said it loudly enough for the people behind her to hear. A few heads turned. A knot of unease began to form in Clara's stomach. She knew her ticket was legitimate. She had booked it herself. I'm sorry, she said, her voice quiet but firm. I believe my seat is confirmed. 2A. Kevin's smile became a fixed plastic line. He wasn't used to being questioned, especially not by someone who looked so unimportant. In his world, important people carried themselves differently. They wore different clothes. They had an aura of entitlement that was completely absent from the young woman standing before him. The system is flagging your ticket, he said, his tone shifting from one of explanation to one of authority. It's just a quick reassignment. It will be much easier if you just come with me. He didn't look at her as he said it, but rather over her shoulder as if she were already a problem being solved. He gestured impatiently towards the jet bridge, a clear signal for her to step aside. The people behind her were starting to shift, their silent glances feeling like physical touches on her skin. She could feel a flush of heat creeping up her neck. Her first instinct, her lifelong instinct, was to avoid confrontation, to not make a scene. Her father had always told her that grace was more powerful than anger. But this wasn't grace. This was injustice. She was being judged, dismissed, and moved along based on nothing but a quick, arrogant appraisal of her appearance, sir. I paid for a business class seat, she tried again, her voice a little stronger. And I am telling you, ma'am, Kevin said. The word ma'am delivered with a heavy dose of condescension that we have a situation. We need to get this flight out on time for all the other passengers. He let the implication hang in the air. Her objection was holding everyone up. That was the final blow. The weight of the stares, the authority in his tone, the sheer exhaustion of her grief, it all collapsed on her at once. She felt small and powerless, a feeling she was getting used to, but never in a place so intimately connected to her father. With a silent nod, she relented. Fine, she whispered. Excellent, Kevin beamed.
Us.
His mask of customer service snapping back into place as he guided her away from the priority lane. A member of the crew will be by shortly to offer you that voucher. We appreciate your cooperation. The walk down the jet bridge was long and echoing. She could hear him murmuring into his radio, explaining the resolution of the seating issue. He didn't use her name. He referred to her as the passenger. She was just an anonymous problem he had smoothed over. As she entered the plane, the difference was immediate. The air in the forward cabin was cool and smelled of leather and clean linen. The seats were wide and inviting, bathed in a soft ambient light. Kevin, however, kept walking. He led her past the plush pods of business class, past the neatly arranged rows of premium economy. He kept going, all the way to the back of the plane where the cabin narrowed and the seats were packed tightly together. The air here was warmer, thick with the sense of recycled air and hundreds of people in a confined space. The noise level was a steady thrum. He stopped at the very last row, next to the galley and the humming door of the lavatory. He pointed to the middle seat, the one with no window, no legroom, and the constant presence of people walking by. There you go, he said cheerfully, as if he had just gifted her a corner office. A member of the crew will be by shortly to offer you that voucher. Enjoy your flight. He turned and walked away before she could respond, his crisp back retreating into the more privileged part of the plane he had just denied her. Clara stood for a moment, staring at the cramped seat. Then, with a sigh that felt like it came from the soles of her feet, she squeezed past the gentleman in the aisle seat and sat down. The armrests dug into her sides. Her knees were almost touching the seat in front of her. She pulled her worn backpack onto her lap, her fingers tracing the familiar worn creases in the leather. She wasn't just a passenger being mistreated. She was an owner, an invisible witness to her own employees' failure to see the person right in front of them. And as the plane began to push back from the gate, she felt a profound and terrifying sense of being completely and utterly trapped. The narrow seat seemed to shrink around her the moment the plane began to move. It wasn't just the physical confinement, the way her shoulders were forced inward, or the way her knees pressed against the hard plastic pocket of the seat in front. It was the weight of the journey she had just taken, the metaphorical walk of shame from the front of the plane to its very tail. Every step down that aisle, with Kevin's hand hovering near her back, had been a silent public declaration of her perceived worthlessness. He hadn't seen a person. He had seen an obstacle, a problem to be efficiently moved out of the way of more important people. She tucked her worn backpack under the seat in front of her, a tight fit that left no room for her feet. The air back here was different. It was warmer, for one, thick with the shared breath of so many people in a small space. It smelled of stale air, faintly of disinfectant, and the cellophane wrappers of snacks already being opened by eager children. The low, constant hum of the plane's systems was louder here, punctuated by the occasional clatter from the nearby galley and the definitive whoosh and click of the lavatory door. This was the engine room of the aircraft, a place of function and utility. A world away from the serene, spacious sanctuary of 2A. A gruff voice beside her cut through her thoughts. That wasn't right, what they did to you. Clara turned her head. The man in the aisle seat was older, with kind, crinkly eyes and a neatly trimmed white beard. He wore a simple tweed jacket and held a well-read paperback in his lap. He had watched the whole thing unfold, A fresh wave of heat washed over Clara's face. It was one thing to feel humiliated in private. It was another to have a stranger validate that humiliation out loud. "Oh," she managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. It's fine. They were busy." The old man shook his head slowly, his gaze firm but gentle. "No, it's not fine. Being busy is no excuse for being unkind. You paid for a seat, just like everyone else. They had no right to treat you that way." He offered a small, reassuring smile. "You handled it with more grace than I would have, my dear. That's for sure." "Thank you," Clara said, and the words felt genuine. His simple act of witnessing and speaking up had chipped away at the isolation of her shame. He saw her. He saw the injustice, even if the flight crew did not, as the plane taxied to the runway. A young flight attendant with a bright, practiced smile appeared in the aisle. She was not Kevin. This woman was younger, her face a mask of cheerful efficiency. She carried a small folder. "Excuse me, miss?" she said, leaning slightly into the row. "I'm so sorry about the mix-up at boarding. On behalf of Zenith Air, please accept this travel voucher for the inconvenience." She held out a glossy card. It promised $500 towards a future flight. It was the generous voucher Kevin had mentioned. Clara just stared at it. $500. It was a sum that wouldn't even cover the difference in the fare she had paid for the business class seat she was denied. But it wasn't about the money. It was about the transactional nature of the fix. A mistake was made, so here is a coupon to make you go away. There was no apology, no acknowledgement of the specific public humiliation. There was only a procedure. Clara took the card, her fingers brushing against the attendant's. "Thank you," she said again, the words feeling hollow. "No problem at all." The attendant chirped, already moving on to the next task. She probably had 100 other things to do. The problem of the girl in the middle seat was officially closed. The roar of the engines filled the cabin as the plane powered down the runway. Clara pressed her forehead against the cold plastic of the window, the vibrations traveling through her skull. She felt a strange disconnection, as if she were watching a movie of someone else's life. This wasn't how things were supposed to be. Her father had built this airline with a singular, unwavering principle. Every single person who stepped onto a Zenith airplane was a guest in his home. He didn't have first-class guests and economy-class guests in his mind. He just had guests. He had walked these aisles, sat in these very seats, and talked to the people who flew with him. He knew their names, their stories. She remembered being a little girl, walking through the airport with him, his hand holding hers so tightly. He'd point out the pilots, the baggage handlers, the gate agents. "These are the people who make the magic happen, Clara," he'd say. "Never, ever forget that. Our planes are just metal. Our brand is just a name. It's the people, the way we treat people, that makes us fly." A sharp, painful ache spread through her chest. He would have been horrified by what had happened. Not just because it happened to his daughter, but because it happened at all. It was a complete corruption of everything he had worked for. Kevin, with his sharp suit and dismissive smile, was a symptom of a disease that had infected the company while she wasn't paying attention. The disease was assuming you could know the value of a person by the clothes on their back. The plane lifted off the ground, pressing her back into the thin cushion. For a moment, the physical sensation was a welcome distraction. She watched the city shrink below, the lights of the runway becoming a constellation that soon faded into the urban sprawl. The world outside was so big and her problems felt so small, and yet so large. She was a billionaire, one of the youngest CEOs of a major corporation in the world. She could have her own private jet. She could buy a ticket on any airline, in any class, and have it all be perfect. And yet here she was, squeezed into a middle seat, feeling utterly powerless. The powerlessness was the most bitter pill to swallow. It was the powerlessness she had felt in the hospital room, watching her father fade. The powerlessness she felt every time she looked at the mountains of financial reports and legal documents on her desk. She was the owner, the final authority, but in the world. She was just Clara, a young woman in a gray sweater. But maybe that was the point. Maybe this was the only way she would have ever seen this side of her own company. If she had flown in first class, Would Kevin have ever treated her this way? No. He would have fawned over her, bringing her extra pillows and offering her champagne. She would have seen the shiny, polished surface of Zenith Air, the one the investors and executives saw. She would not have seen the rotting foundation that Kevin represented. He wasn't just one bad employee. He was the result of a culture that had somehow lost its way. A culture that valued the appearance of authority over the substance of service. The flight attendant came by with drinks. Clara asked for a water. The flight attendant didn't look at her, just handed her the small plastic cup with a practiced, distant smile. There was no connection, no warmth. It was just another item on a checklist. In the seat next to her, the old man, Arthur, was offered a drink. And the attendant paused for a moment, asking him about his book. It was a tiny difference, but Clara saw it. She saw the subtle ways people were categorized. Even back here in economy, Clara took a slow sip of the water, the plastic cup flimsy in her hand. The initial burning sting of humiliation was beginning to cool, hardening into something else. It was a quiet, cold certainty. The walk to the back of the plane had been humiliating. The plane ride itself was uncomfortable. But this moment of clarity, this was something else entirely. She was no longer just a victim of a rude flight attendant. She was an owner who had just been handed a free front row ticket to her company's biggest failure. And as she stared out at the endless expanse of blue sky, she knew with a certainty that settled deep in her bones that this was a flight she was meant to take. The hours began to stretch and merge into one long, monotonous drone. The initial shock of Clara's situation had settled into a dull, aching resignation. The movie on the tiny screen in front of her was a blur of color and sound that she couldn't focus on. The meal, a tepid tray of pasta and a sad, wilted salad, had been consumed without a thought of taste. She was an automaton, going through the motions of a long-haul flight. Her mind a million miles away, and yet trapped completely in the discomfort of the moment. The old man in the aisle seat, whose name she had learned was Arthur, had tried to engage her in conversation a few times. He asked about her studies, about her plans in London. He was kind, and his attempts to draw her out were a gentle warmth in the coldness of her mood. She answered his questions politely, but her heart wasn't in it. She couldn't bring herself to fabricate a life for herself, to pretend she was just another student. The lie felt too heavy, too close to the surface of this very real experience. Arthur seemed to understand, and after a while, he retreated into his book, occasionally glancing over at her with a look of quiet concern. It was about 5 hours into the flight. When the cabin lights were dimmed and most passengers were either sleeping or lost in their own private worlds, that a new presence stirred the air. A man in a crisp, dark uniform with 4 gold stripes on his epaulets moved slowly through the economy cabin. He was the captain. He had a calm, steady gait and an air of quiet authority that was entirely different from Kevin's brittle posturing. This was the authority of someone who was trusted, who was responsible for hundreds of lives. Clara recognized him instantly. It was David Evans, a senior captain who had been with Zenith Air for over 20 years. Her father had spoken of him often with immense respect. "He's the best in the business, Clara," her father would say. "He understands that his job isn't just to fly the plane, but to command the trust of everyone on it." She had met him once, very briefly, at a company holiday party years ago. He probably wouldn't remember her, a quiet teenager lingering in the corner of the ballroom. But she remembered his kind eyes and the way he had spoken to her like an adult, as Captain Evans made his customary walk through the cabin. He stopped every so often to exchange a quiet word with a flight attendant or to check on a sleeping child. He was a reassuring presence, a living symbol of the safety and professionalism her father had always insisted upon. He was a reminder of what Zenith Air was supposed to be. He spotted Arthur in the aisle seat first. A flicker of recognition crossed the captain's face. "Mr. Harrison," he said, his voice a low, pleasant rumble that was respectful without being overly familiar. "Good to see you again. I trust your flight is comfortable." Arthur looked up from his book, his gaze shifting meaningfully towards the young woman in the middle seat. Clara was still staring out the window, her profile illuminated by the soft glow of the cabin lights, a picture of weary disappointment. "It's been enlightening, Captain," Arthur said, his voice laced with a dry, understated irony. Captain Evans's eyebrows drew together slightly. He followed Arthur's gaze, his eyes landing on Clara. At first, he saw only a young traveler, perhaps a student who had drawn the short straw with a middle seat. But then he looked closer. He saw the shape of her jaw, the determined set of her mouth, the quiet intelligence in her eyes, even in profile. The face clicked into place in his memory. It was a face he had seen in the company's internal magazine, in the photos from the memorial service for her father. It was a face he had seen on the news, a face that now represented the future of the very airline he had dedicated his life to. Just then, the source of Clara's predicament appeared in the aisle. Kevin, his uniform still perfectly pressed, was doing his final rounds before the next service. He spotted the captain, and his entire demeanor changed. His back straightened, his chin lifted, and his smile widened into a mask of eager-to-please subservience. "Captain, good evening," he said, his voice smooth and confident. "Everything is running smoothly in the cabin. We had a small overbooking issue earlier. But this young lady was very cooperative and agreed to move to economy." He gestured towards Clara with a proprietary air, as if he were presenting a solved problem for the captain's approval. "I took care of it personally." The air around them seemed to thicken, to crackle. Captain Evans's face, which had been relaxed and kind, became a mask of stone. His eyes narrowed, but he didn't look at Kevin. He kept them fixed on Clara, whose name he now knew with a sickening certainty. The full, ugly weight of the situation landed on him with the force of a physical blow. It wasn't just a mistake. It was a catastrophic failure of his crew's judgment, and by extension, his own. They had not only inconvenienced a passenger, they had publicly humiliated their owner. He took a deliberate step closer to Clara's row, his movements slow and controlled. He ignored Kevin completely. "Miss Vance," he said, his voice low, careful, and filled with a deference that was jarring in its intensity. "Clara Vance." For the first time in hours, Clara turned away from the window. She met the captain's gaze, and in his eyes, she saw it all: the shock, the dawning horror, and the deep, profound apology. The weariness in her face was replaced by a flicker of surprise, then a slow, weary nod. There was no triumph in her expression, only a sad, quiet acknowledgement that he finally understood. The shift was instantaneous and absolute. Kevin's face went from smug to ashen. The color drained from his cheeks, leaving a pale, waxy sheen. His eyes darted wildly between the captain's stony profile and Clara's calm one. The words "overbooking issue" and "cooperative young lady" echoed in his head, each syllable now a charge in a fatal electrical circuit. He saw the captain's rigid posture, the way he refused to even glance in his direction. He heard the sharp intake of breath from Arthur in the next seat. He saw the dawning recognition on the faces of a few other passengers who had been watching. The reality of what he had done, and to whom he had done it, crashed down on him. The captain of the aircraft was standing before the young woman he had treated like cargo, dressing her with the respect one would give a head of state. It was the only confirmation he needed. He hadn't just broken a rule, he had broken the most sacred rule of all, and his career was flashing before his eyes. The cabin around them, once a sea of private bubbles, seemed to shrink into a small, silent stage. The hum of the engines and the distant murmur of a crying baby faded into the background. All that remained was the charged silence of the aisle, where a young woman in a simple sweater held the entire history and future of a company in her quiet, steady gaze. Captain Evans finally tore his eyes from Clara, turning his full, terrifying focus onto Kevin. His voice, when he spoke, was no longer a low rumble. It was a blade of ice, sharp and precise, and carrying across the rows. "Kevin, my office." The moment we land, he didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. The finality in his tone was more powerful than any shout. He then turned his attention to a senior female flight attendant who was standing nearby, her face pale with shock. "Please ensure Miss Vance is immediately escorted back to her original seat. Her every need is to be met personally by you." For the remainder of this flight, the captain gave Clara one last look, a look of deep, unwavering regret. Before he turned and walked away, his back ramrod straight, He didn't look back at Kevin, who remained frozen in the aisle. A man caught in the unforgiving glare of a truth he had tried so hard to ignore. The walk of shame was over. The walk of vindication was just beginning. The transformation in the cabin was as swift as it was absolute. The air, once thick with the anonymous drone of a long flight, was now charged with a silent electric energy. Every passenger within a few rows was watching. A captive audience to a drama that was playing out without a single spoken word. Captain Evans's departure had left a vacuum. Into that space poured a new and powerful force. Vindication, Clara remained in her seat for a moment, the reality of the shift still settling over her. The senior flight attendant, a woman named Helen, who had been with the airline for nearly 2 decades, moved with an urgency that was both apologetic and reverent. She was a stark contrast to Kevin's brittle efficiency. Her face was a mixture of shock and a deep, personal embarrassment that had nothing to do with policy and everything to do with a failure of basic human decency. "Miss Vance," Helen whispered, her voice trembling slightly as she leaned over the aisle seat. I am so sorry. Please, let us help you." The apology was different from the one offered with the voucher. This one was real. It was raw. It wasn't a scripted procedure. It was a plea for forgiveness. Arthur, in the aisle seat, had already unbuckled his seatbelt and was on his feet, offering her a hand to help her up. The simple gesture, offered with a warm, knowing smile, was more comforting than any official apology could ever be. Justice finds a way. "My dear," he said softly as she stood and gathered her backpack. The journey back to the front of the plane was the polar opposite of her earlier walk. This time, it was not a walk of shame, but a procession of redemption. She didn't have to squeeze past anyone. People in the rows she passed seemed to shrink back, creating a clear path for her. They didn't stare with judgment, but with a wide-eyed, almost reverent curiosity. A few people offered small, encouraging smiles. A businessman in a crisp suit, who had looked right through her when she first boarded, now watched her pass with an expression of stunned awe. She caught a glimpse of Kevin as they passed the forward galley. He stood by the coffee machine, his posture rigid, his face ashen and devoid of all color. He looked like a statue that had been left out in a storm. He didn't look at her. He couldn't. Stared at a spot on the wall, his eyes unfocused as if his entire world had collapsed inward. Helen guided her firmly past him, a subtle protective gesture, and Kevin's shame was no longer his alone. It was a public spectacle. The first-class cabin felt like a different world. The air was cool, the carpet plushed under her feet. Helen led her directly to seat 2A. It was a pod, a private sanctuary of leather and polished wood. There was a small bouquet of white orchids on the console, a bottle of chilled water waiting, and a soft, plush blanket draped over the seat. This was not just a seat. It was an apology in physical form. "Please, make yourself comfortable," Helen said, her voice earnest. "Is there anything at all I can get for you? A warm towel? A glass of champagne? Anything." Clara sank into the generous leather chair, the exhaustion of the past few hours finally catching up with her. She looked at Helen, seeing the genuine worry and regret in her eyes. "Just a water, please," Clara said, her voice quiet. "And thank you, Helen." As Helen moved to fulfill her request, Clara let out a long, slow breath. She was back in her rightful place, but the world felt completely different. The leather seat felt less like a luxury and more like a command post. She wasn't a passenger receiving special treatment. She was an owner who had been forced to witness a critical flaw in her own house. A few minutes later, Captain Evans returned. He had shed his pilot's jacket and stood before her in his white shirt, his shoulders now slumped with the weight of his failure. He looked older, more tired than he had just moments before. He didn't sit. He stood at a respectful distance, his hands clasped behind his back. "Miss Vance," he began, and the formality of his tone was thick with self-reproach. "On behalf of Zenith Air, on behalf of every crew member on this flight, and on behalf of myself, I am profoundly sorry. There is no excuse for what happened. What you experienced is a perversion of everything this airline stands for. It is a personal and professional failure on my part." Clara listened, her expression unreadable. She could see the sincerity in his eyes. He wasn't just apologizing to a passenger. He was apologizing to his former boss's daughter, the keeper of a legacy he felt he had just tarnished. "It's not about me, Captain," she said, her voice cutting through his apology with a quiet strength that surprised him. "It's not about a seat. It's not about me being treated poorly." She paused, gathering her thoughts. "My father built this company on the idea that the person in the middle seat in the last row was just as important as the person in the flatbed seat at the front. He believed that the true measure of our success wasn't our profit margins, but the dignity we afforded every single person who trusted us to get them from one place to another. Tonight, one of your employees felt empowered to make a judgment call based on what a passenger looked like. That wasn't just a bad decision, Captain. That was a symptom of a sickness in our culture." She looked past him out the small window at the dark sky and the endless clouds. "The problem isn't Kevin. The problem is that we have created an environment where a man like Kevin believes that his job is to manage problems, not to serve people. He thought he was protecting the airline from a perceived inconvenience, but he was actually poisoning it. That's the issue we have to solve." Captain Evans stood in stunned silence. He had expected anger, demands for compensation, perhaps even a call for Kevin to be fired on the spot. He had not expected a diagnosis of the company's soul. He had not expected a lesson in leadership from a 23-year-old woman he had just found crammed into a middle seat. He saw, in that moment, why her father had trusted her with the company. It wasn't about inheritance. It was about understanding. She understood the heart of the business better than anyone. "What? What would you have me do?" he asked, his voice thick with emotion. Clara finally turned to look at him, her eyes clear and focused. "When we land, you will handle Kevin according to your established procedures. But that's just treating the symptom. I want you to come see me in my office next week. I want you to help me. I want you to help me fix this. I want you to help me bring my father's vision back. We don't need to punish our way to a better culture. We need to lead our way to one." The flight continued, but the dynamic was irrevocably changed. Helen hovered nearby, ensuring Clara's every need was met, but not out of fear, out of a renewed sense of purpose. Arthur, from his seat in economy, had been upgraded to an empty business class seat nearby, and he would occasionally catch Clara's eye and give a small, approving nod. He was no longer just a fellow passenger. He was a witness to a turning point. As the plane began its descent into London, city lights glittering like a spilled handful of diamonds, Clara knew this flight was over. The humiliation had been real. The injustice had stung. But they had been the fuel for something much larger. The walk to the back of the plane had stripped away her anonymity and forced her to claim her authority not with words. The consequence of Kevin's actions wasn't his impending discipline. The true consequence was the quiet, resolute plan that was now taking shape in Clara's mind. She was landing not just in London, but at the beginning of the real work she was born to do. The landing was smooth, a testament to Captain Evans's skill, even under a mountain of professional shame. As the plane taxied to the gate, the familiar chime of the fasten seatbelt sign signified the end of the journey, but for Clara, it felt like the beginning. The lights in the cabin came up, revealing the faces of passengers stirring from their long-distance haze. A few dared to glance towards the front of the cabin, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and awe. They were no longer anonymous travelers. They were witnesses to a story they would tell for years. Clara stayed seated as the aisles filled with the bustle of departure. She watched Helen and the other crew members work with a new, focused intensity, their movements efficient, but infused with a warmth that had been absent at the start of the flight. It was a small change, but Clara felt it. It was the first flicker of a cultural shift. Arthur appeared beside her pod, his face warm and kind. He had been upgraded, but he still carried the same gentle air of the man who had sat beside her in the last row. "Well, my dear," he said, his voice low, "that was certainly the most interesting flight I've had in 30 years of flying Zenith Air." Clara managed a small, genuine smile. "I'm sorry it had to be so dramatic." "Nonsense." He chuckled softly. "Sometimes a little drama is needed to remind people what matters." I hope you don't mind, but I gave your name and my version of events to the purser. I felt a statement from a neutral party might be helpful. Thank you, Arthur, Clara said, her gratitude sincere. More than you know. He gave her a little pat on the arm. Your father would be incredibly proud. Not just of what you did, but of how you did it. Keep that fire, but keep that grace too. It's a rare combination. A final reassuring nod. He turned and joined the flow of passengers disembarking. When the cabin was nearly empty, Clara finally stood. Captain Evans was waiting at the forward galley door. He had his jacket back on, his captain's hat in his hand. He looked tired, but his eyes were clear. He gestured for her to walk with him as they stepped into the jet bridge. Away from the ears of the last departing passengers, he spoke. Kevin has been grounded, pending a formal review. He will not be flying again until the process is complete. We will follow protocol to the letter. Clara nodded. That's fair. It's important that everyone knows the rules apply to everyone, but that's not what you really want to talk about, is it? He said, a statement, not a question. No, she agreed. It's not. She stopped and turned to face him. The sounds of the airport echoed around them. Captain Evans, I want to hire you, not to fly a plane. I want to create a new role for you. I need a chief of culture. Or a head of service integrity. We can figure out the title. I need someone who understands the DNA of this company. Someone who has my father's original vision in their bones. I need someone to lead the training, to work with HR, to be the moral compass of the entire operation. The captain was visibly taken aback. He had been expecting anger, demands, maybe even a lawsuit. He had been preparing for a fight to save his own career. He had not been prepared for a promotion and a mission. Miss Vance. I don't know what to say. Say yes, she said, her voice soft but firm. Help me fix this. Help me build it back stronger than it was before. Not with fear, but with purpose. We start with the training. We don't just teach people how to serve drinks and operate safety equipment. We teach them how to see people, how to treat every single person, no matter what they're wearing or what ticket they hold. Like they are the most important person on the plane, because in that moment they are. 3 weeks later, Clara stood in the main boardroom at Zenith Air headquarters. It was a sweeping, impressive space with panoramic views of the airport runways and a long, polished table that could seat 20. She stood not at the head of the table, but at a large screen at the side. Around the table sat her most senior executives, a mix of old, loyal faces from her father's era and new, sharp minds who had been brought in to manage the finances and logistics. On the screen was the title slide of a new presentation. It read, Project Dignity. Below it, in smaller text, were the words, Our renewed promise to every guest. Good morning, Clara began, her voice steady and clear. It was the first time she had addressed the entire executive team with a major initiative of her own. 3 weeks ago, I took a flight from home to London. Like many of you, I've been flying Zenith Air my whole life. But this flight was different. This flight taught me more about our company than any financial report or shareholder meeting ever could. She didn't tell them the whole story. She didn't need to. She told them a version of it, a case study, stripped of names and details, but not of its core truth. A young passenger, dressed casually, was downgraded from a paid business class seat. The decision was made by a crew member based on a quick, unconscious judgment about the passenger's perceived value to the airline. The passenger accepted, not wanting to cause a scene. A tense silence filled the room. Some of the executives shifted uncomfortably in their seats. They all knew who the passenger was. The story had already become a quiet legend within the company. This isn't a story about one bad employee, Clara continued, her eyes scanning the faces around the table. This is a story about a culture that allowed that employee to believe his actions were acceptable. It's a story about a system where overbooked became an excuse for unimportant. My father did not build an airline so we could decide who was important. He built an airline to serve everyone. Somewhere along the way, we lost that. We started focusing on profits and on-time performance and shareholder value. We forgot that all of those things are a result of one thing: service. True, dignified, unconditional service. She clicked to the next slide. It was a picture of a full plane, with faces of all ages, races, and backgrounds, looking out the windows. This is who we fly. Not just the people in the front. All of them. Project Dignity will be a complete overhaul of our training and our performance metrics. Every single employee, from the CEO to the baggage handlers, will go through this training. She introduced Captain Evans, who stood and outlined the curriculum. It was practical, human-centric, and rooted in real-world scenarios. It taught about unconscious bias, about communication, about the simple, profound power of looking someone in the eye and seeing a person, not a problem. There were role-playing exercises about difficult situations, all designed to reinforce one core principle: dignity first, in the months that followed. The program was rolled out across the globe. Kevin, after his disciplinary period, was offered a position in the training department. It was Clara's idea. She felt that someone who had so profoundly failed at the front line could become its most powerful teacher. He was reluctant at first, but eventually accepted. He became the face of the what not to do scenarios, his own story of shame serving as a powerful, humbling lesson for new hires. Clara still flew on her own airline, often in economy. She never announced herself. She would sit in a middle seat or a window seat, a book in her lap, just listening. And she heard the change. She heard flight attendants address passengers by name. She saw them go the extra mile for a family with a crying baby or an elderly person who needed help with their bag. The change was subtle, but it was there. A quiet hum of genuine care running beneath the operational noise of a major airline. One evening, a year later, Clara was looking out the window of her office, watching a Zenith airplane climb into the sunset sky, its silver body gleaming. The logo on its tail, a stylized bird in flight, seemed to glow in the fading light. She thought of Arthur, the kind stranger who had been her first ally. She thought of Captain Evans, the man who helped her turn a moment of injustice into a movement. She thought of Kevin, the man who had, in his own way, become her most valuable teacher. She was still the same modest young woman from the airport, but the flight from London had changed her. It had taught her that ownership wasn't a title or a bank balance. It was a responsibility. It was the courage to sit in the worst seat on the plane and have the vision to see how to make every seat the best it could be. The plane she was watching climbed higher and higher, a single bright point of light in a vast, darkening sky. It was carrying hundreds of people, each with their own story, each worthy of dignity. And for the first time since her father had passed, Clara Vance felt like she was truly and finally flying.